Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Corning Museum of Glass Amphitheater. This morning we have a very special demonstration in store for you all here. We're going to be doing what we call a You Design It, We Make It. It's a collaboration with our guests and fans all around the world where we give a prompt for what we want to be making, and then people submit different ideas. And our hot glass team chooses among these ideas for what piece we'll be making. So the theme for today is amazing androids, but before I jump too far into that, I'd like to introduce our team to you all here. Our lead glassmaker for this demonstration will be Helen Tegeler. We'll call her the gaffer on occasion. And then helping her out today will be Rochelle. And my name is Alex. I'm here for you all. I'll be explaining this process to you today. And if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to get my attention. I'd love to answer them for you. So today's prompt was amazing androids. We were looking for some designs of different robots and creatures that are mechanical. It's one I'm particularly excited about. I'm a big sci-fi fan ever since I was a child. Our artist today, her name is Vanessa Rodriguez, and she gave us this submission. It's a retro android. It's very inspired by donuts. So this android created her sprinkle skirt to look like a donut, and then also has on a bowling shirt top, so to just go with the retro theme. So I'm going to read to you what Vanessa sent to us. She's an android that loves anything retro and donut. One day she decided that she would give herself a makeover. She bent some metal into a 1950s skirt with sprinkles to look like a donut and painted a retro bowling shirt on her. She's the most proud of her hair. In the year 3000, she got her pink glass hair done at the Corning Museum of Glass. She heard it was all the rage. It came out perfect and smooth, with a slight clearness that makes it look like sugar icing. She's always looking for ways to break out of the norm and express herself and help others to see that it's okay to stand out in a good way and help others. So I think that's really exciting. It's an android that's very progressive. And so we have here, Helen's working on some of the parts for this android. I believe this will be an arm. And she's applied some color to that arm, a gray color, I believe. And the way that we're coloring our glass here today is through the use of frit. So frit is chopped up colored glass. It can come in a variety of sizes, from a very fine powder that you can sift onto the clear glass to like a pea gravel size. So they're using something that's kind of the size of the sugar that you'd put on top of muffins. I think that's pretty fitting for our design that we have here today. Now, whenever we're starting the process, we begin with clear glass, which is held inside of this large melting furnace here. Inside of this furnace, it's 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit, and at that temperature, our glass moves and behaves quite a bit like warmed up honey. So it's pretty runny, pretty gooey. And our glassmakers have to constantly be rotating the irons that the glass is attached to in order to keep that material from drifting down to the ground. When you first start working with glass, the first thing you tend to make is just a big mess on the floor. You get so excited that you've gotten that material out of the furnace to begin with, and sometimes forget that it's necessary to keep that pipe rotating. But we're going to see these two making a pretty complicated sculpture here today. They're actually preparing parts and then setting them aside in an oven that holds them at 950 degrees. Now, the glass has to be held above a certain temperature because if it gets too cold too quickly, it'll actually crack and break. And that can be pretty unproductive when you're trying to make something. So right now they're making an attachment onto that arm. That's the elbow and the forearm they've just created. And that's going to be stored in what we call a garage. That garage is held at 950 degrees, and it just keeps the glass warm enough so that it's not going to crack and break, but cold enough so that it's not moving and warping in the shape that it gets put in. Our raw ingredients for our glass are silica sand, soda ash, and limestone. To make the different colors that we're using here today, different metal oxides are added to those ingredients. So for example, cobalt will make your glass a beautiful blue. If you have gold in your glass, it'll make it a beautiful pink. Cadmium can make yellows, and copper will make a lovely teal blue. We're working with a gray here today. I'm not certain what all ingredients go into that. But there's a lot of different ways that you can create designs using colors with glass. Today we're using frit, which is that powdered or crushed up colored glass I was talking about. You can also use bar color glass. That looks a little something like this. And when you're using this, it's too large to just attach onto your clear glass. You actually have to preheat that rod of glass in order to pick it up and turn it into a form. But right now, Helen's sculpting that arm. She's using some shears to kind of bend it around. She's using an oxygen propane fueled torch to make the attachments onto that glass, making sure that it's sealed exactly where it needs to be. But that torch can be a really handy tool when you're sculpting with glass. You can very precisely heat up specific areas in order to nudge them where you need them to go. When we're using our large reheating furnaces, just kind of everything gets hot. So when you're trying to sculpt something that's very delicate and very detailed, having one of those hot torches available is really useful. Now we have this really awesome view inside of our reheating furnace. This is unique to Corning Museum, and it's due not to a very cool camera, but to a very cool piece of glass that's seated in the back of that reheating furnace. That glass is called fused silica. It melts at around 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which makes it perfectly comfortable in that 2,000 degree oven. So this program, that you design it, we make it, is really neat. We have it going throughout the fall here. We have 2 upcoming programs where you can still submit designs for them. The next one that's coming up is called Things That Go Bump in the Night. The deadline for submissions for that one will be October 28th, and then the piece will be made on Halloween, I believe. So to get to these prompts to be able to submit an idea, you can go to our website, cmog.org, cmog.org, go to all upcoming events and programs, select the YDI prompt link, and then that will allow you to choose the prompt that you want to submit an idea for. You create a drawing, a little artist statement, submit that, and if your idea gets chosen, you can actually watch it streamed live right here, and then you can have that object sent to you if you're out of town for a small fee, or you can come in and pick it up yourself if you're local. So I think that's a pretty neat thing about these programs that we do. Is that not only do you get to be an artist designing something for glass, but also you can take that piece home with you. So it looks like we're starting on another arm here, perhaps. Helen's adding some of that gray color to a clear base. Right now she's melting all of that color smooth with the clear, making it all one cohesive piece of glass. And then meanwhile, over on this side, Chris is getting ready to store the other arm that they just made in our garage unit to keep it up to temperature. Now, we get asked on occasion how long you can work on a piece of glass, and the answer is really indefinitely. You can spend time making little parts, putting them aside into a garage like this, or putting them into an annealing oven, bringing them back down to room temperature so you can work on that piece another day. Now, we won't be holding all of you here indefinitely, of course. This program will last about 2 hours, so that we have the time to make this piece with all the details involved. But I think that's a really interesting thing that we don't all always think about with glass. It's just how long you can be standing in front of a 2,000-degree furnace working on a project. And the answer is really you can spend days doing that. And even after the project is made, you can spend a lot of time cold working a piece of glass, carving away at it, creating different designs by faceting the surface of the material. So this is a process that can take a very short amount of time, only a few minutes to make a tumbler, say, to several hours to create very intricately designed sculptures, or just intricately designed patterns on glass. Those can take hours as well. So I'm trying to listen into our team a little bit to see what's going on here. It looks like they're going to be puntying this part that Helen's been working on. And when you punty a piece of glass, you're trading it from one pipe to another to get access to the portion of the glass that's closest to the original pipe. So in this case, it looks like they'll be puntying another arm. This will give them access to the elbow of that arm so that they can add on the forearm. So Helen takes that piece of glass, sticks it onto her form. She'll thermally shock the glass using a few drops of water. And all it takes to set that free is a light tap. Now, when you first begin working with glass, doing that punty exchange is the most intimidating part of the process. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. If something's too cold and you go to break it free from your pipe, it might release from both irons and fall onto the ground. Or you can potentially stick that punty on too hot. Then it'll be fused on permanently and you'll never get it off of there cleanly. Now, Helen's been working with glass for 26 years now, and Chris has been working with glass for around 21 years. So we have a lot of experience here on the team today. When you first begin working with glass, it's not just that punty exchange that's really difficult, but really everything in general. Just turning the pipe can be a lot of effort, really take a lot of your focus, let alone creating something that you plan to create rather than what accidentally happens out of the glass. It takes around 3 to 6 years to become a proficient beginner with this material. And that's because you're looking at a lot of strange muscle memories, but also just learning different things about the glass itself. If it gets too cold, it'll break. If you get it too hot, it can crumple up on itself. And especially when you're working with sculpture, you don't want to get that glass too hot. You don't want those arms to be twisting from being overheated or something to potentially fold up on itself from being too hot. So it really takes a lot of time in the studio to get all of those things down. It looks like we're going to be adding that next bit of forearm on. So Chris brings over a hot bit of glass that also is colored gray. Helen sticks it down where she wants it to go and then cuts it free using a pair of diamond shears. Now, those shears are really interesting. They cut on 4 facets rather than 2. We call them diamond shears because they look like they have a little diamond in them. But they can be really useful for cutting glass because it cuts it and squeezes the glass down into a concise point, whereas if you're using straight shears, it'll leave a long cold spot on your glass. So these shears are really neat and really handy to have around. Now, we also have an assortment of crimps that we can use to help us with this sculpting. Right now, Helen's using a pair of crimps that have a wedge shape to them. That's helping her create the angles needed to have an android. And I think that's probably one of the trickiest things about this prompt that we have here today. Glass really wants to be round. In fact, if you just heat it up continuously, it'll form a big marble. So creating sharp angles out of the glass is going to take a lot of skill. Helen's superheating the surface of the material at times and then using a tool to smooth it flat. And that's really the best strategy to getting those sharp, crisp angles that we want on our android. Now, we get asked sometimes as well, why we're not wearing gloves when we're doing this. I see a few nods in our audience. It seems scary, right? Well, gloves really affect your dexterity. It's a bit like trying to tie your shoes with gloves on. It's pretty tricky. So as much as possible, we aim to avoid doing that. Now, that being said, we might see Helen throw a pair of gloves on if she's going to be working with her hands really close to that glass. But overall, everywhere that her hands are right now is perfectly safe to be touching. The pipes that we're using are made out of stainless steel, and we preheat the ends of them so that the glass will adhere to it. But the middle section, where they handle the pipe, is normal temperature, just room temperature, very comfortable to handle. And if those pipes get too hot, we have this lovely little water feature here where we can run water over the pipe, cool down the temperature of it, be able to hold it a little closer to the heat source. So our designer, Vanessa Rodriguez, is watching, and she just informed us that she's decided to call this android Sprinklebot. I think that's a pretty suitable name for it. I apologize, I'm kind of tripping on my own tongue here a little bit. Thank you for that, Vanessa. I was wondering what we were going to be calling this android. It's so much fun looking. We really needed a name, and I think Sprinklebot is perfect. So it looks like Helen's begun on another part of this. Is this going to be the top? All right. So she's adding an amber color onto her clear glass, and this is going to form that bowling shirt torso part of the android. So again, we're using that frit, and it just goes so well with the design. We have a very sprinkly looking android, and frit tends to look like sprinkles as well, so it'll work out just perfectly. So another coat of that color, and then she takes it right over to the reheating furnace, melting it all smooth. It looks like, are we using a blowpipe for this one?
Sorry, is it blown?
The head will be, most of it will be.
So yes, this is on a blowpipe. So this is a hollow stainless steel rod, and that's what allows us to inflate the glass through a big metal straw, essentially. And we have a question here. Yeah. Yeah, what was Helen's training, or any of our training really? How do we become glass blowers? Well, Helen learned how to blow glass in college, actually, and that's pretty common these days for artists, especially younger glass blowers, to get exposed to this material in school. So you go to an art school, you find out they have a glass program, you go, oh, this is a lot of fun playing with lava. And then when you're in art school, you tend to have other classes you're taking, kind of a social life going on most likely. So you don't tend to come out of art school a super good glass blower. But you can also supplement your education with different workshops in glass, or taking classes such as we have right across the street here at the studio, where you can learn from other artists. That's also the other way to get into glassmaking, is through taking those workshops, whether it's a weekend workshop or a week-long workshop. That'll get your hands into the studio, get you gathering glass, get you collecting the material, shaping it up. So those are really the two common ways to get into this medium today. Now, traditionally, glassmaking was a factory-based thing where you would go in as an apprentice, start learning about the material, and then eventually they'd say, all right, you're a pretty good beginner. We'll allow you to help out around the studio now. Now, the building that we are in currently is the footprint of the Steuben glass factory. And they had a program where you had to spend 10,000 hours in the studio working before they would allow you to assist on the floor. So that gives you an idea for just how long you have to be working with this material before you can really start to be helpful around a studio. Does that answer your question well? Awesome. Now, Chris also learned in college. I learned going to a studio and just taking classes, but now I'm in college, and I'll be graduating in May from Alfred University, which is just an hour west of here. So that's one of the many studios that, or many schools that have glass studios in them. All right, to check back in with the team here, it looks like we've inflated a little bubble of glass. And they're shaping this, they're trying to get that nice crispy square form out of this. And again, that's a really tough thing to do with glass. This material really wants to be round, or at the very least have rounded edges. So Helen's using 2 graphite paddles to squish and push that glass around. And then they're also using this steel table here. Now that table is actually a tool called a marver. And we'll use it in all sorts of different stages for this. But primarily when we're using it, we are using it to steal heat out of the glass. Anytime they punty something, you'll see Chris rolling a little bit of glass on that table. And that's both to shape it and to steal a little of the heat out of it. There can be several reasons for wanting to cool down glass, whether that's to make a connection temporary or to preserve thickness in certain areas of your bubble. If you don't want it to inflate in an area, you want to cool it down there so that when that inflation begins, the glass that's moving the most is inflating the most. The glass that you cooled down isn't moving as much. But it looks like we have a nice crispy form here. It's nice and angular, just like we want for our Android.
I'm gonna let's put a little.
And I'll check in. Do we have any questions from our viewers online so far?
Then I can flip it around the other direction and.
So put a little green wall on there.
Yeah, that we're gonna add the neck right now.
Yeah, are coloring materials tiny bits of glass shards, or are they tiny bits of colored sand? Well, they're little bits of glass shards, but they can come down into a grain size distribution. You can get them in different ranges of sizes, so they can look very much like sand, but they're actually little particles of glass. That's a great question. Now, there are several different types of glass, multiple different types of glass. What we're working with today is called soda lime glass. And that's the most common type of glass in our daily lives. It makes up our windows, our pickle jars, our wine bottles. But there are a lot of different types of soda lime glass as well. They all have the same main 3 ingredients, the silica sand, soda ash, and limestone. But if you change the ratio of those ingredients, you'll fundamentally change how that glass behaves. So if you were to say, reduce the amount of soda ash in the glass, that reduces the amount of flux in the material, and that creates a much stiffer glass that sets up very quickly. That's used a lot in automated processes, such as making pickle jars or wine bottles, or even window glass. But our glass is designed to stay hot for a very long period of time, so it has a larger amount of flux than those commercial products do. That allows us to be able to shape the glass outside of the heat for a much longer period of time than we would if we were working with those different types. Yeah, we have a question here. Does that make it more fragile? No, not really. All types of glass are very brittle when they're at room temperature. And changing the ingredients, the ratio of the ingredients, doesn't necessarily make it weaker. Now, if you get rid of the limestone in those ingredients, however, you'll end up with a water-soluble glass, which is really interesting. Now, that means that it will be deteriorating with humidity in the atmosphere. So if you go through our exhibits today, look at some of the older ones, you'll notice that they're in humidity-controlled cases because back in ancient times, not only did they have to have a higher amount of flux in their glass, they didn't have that limestone in it either. But so we have to control the humidity in those cases so that those objects aren't deteriorating. Yeah. Yeah. So we had a question from online. Do glass makers have a preferred temperature range that they like to work in, or are you bound by the parameters of the material itself? And I would say it really depends on what you're doing. If you're sculpting with glass and making a lot of fine details, especially points in the material, say you're sculpting a dragon and he's got horns on his head, you don't want to get that material too hot because the horns will just melt and they won't be what you made them to be. Now, if you're working with very thin glass, you want to work much hotter because thin glass cools down quicker. So it really just depends on what you're doing, and that will dictate how you work with the material. In the beginning, when you first start working with glass, there's a tendency to work with the material much too cold. You're really muscling everything and really trying to push it around, using all of your muscles to do it. And then you realize about a year later, oh, if I just got it hot, it would pretty much happen on its own. Sorry. Okay, so we've had another question about glass. Is the temperature to melt minerals to turn into glass the same temperature to melt recycled glass? You know, I don't think that it is. I think that when you're working with glass, when you're melting the raw ingredients for glass, you're chemically changing those raw ingredients. So they have to be heated for a longer period of time, and they tend to be heated a little warmer so that they can chemically change into a liquid glass. When you're melting recycled glass, or say cullet, that's once melted glass that you can buy as a glass maker to throw into your furnace. When you're melting that material, you don't have to use as much energy to melt it down. So I think that would probably be the answer for that. Yeah, they're two different things, two different processes with the same outcome. Now, when you're recycling glass, you can only recycle it so many times without having to add additional flux to the material. And that's because the flux is the first thing to kind of melt out when you bring it up to high temperatures. So if you're constantly recycling and recycling and recycling and not compensating for that loss of flux, you'll end up with a different type of glass than you started off with. Kind of a weird thing. I'm going to check in over here, though. Looks like we've got something interesting going on. Oh, this is the head of the robot. Okay. So Helen is adding on those triangular kind of sunglasses-looking eyes. And to do that, she's essentially painting them on using a rod of black glass and using the torch to heat up that glass until it's molten and then smearing it on the surface of the material. Now, this is a really tricky technique. Helen has to really nail where she's putting that on the first go. Because if you touch two pieces of glass together when they're hot, they're gonna stick together. And if you mess it up, it's really tricky to fix it. So right now she's really accentuating the angles on those eyes using a metal pick to kind of push them, really make them nice and pointy. And then a very high-tech tool here, a butter knife, to further refine that shape. So she's both making sure that the edges are nice and straight, but also that there's not a lot of texture on the surface of the eye itself. Now, we can only work on this for so long outside of the heat. If that head gets too cold, there's the potential for it to crack and break. So every now and then, Chris has to take that head over to the reheating furnace, warm everything up a little bit to avoid that nasty consequence. So when Helen has those eyes exactly the way she wants them, I suspect we'll be moving on to the other details of the face. I'm really looking forward to the hair especially, that beautiful pink hair that this robot got here at Corning Museum. So again, just as a reminder for those of you that joined us a little late, those of you online just tuning in, we are doing more of these You Design It, We Make It programs in the upcoming months. You can find information for those on our website and also where you can submit for them on the website as well. The next upcoming one will be Things That Go Bump in the Night. And then the one after that will be We've Got Spirit, Yes We Do. And that one is all about designing a new mascot for whatever team you support, whether it's imaginary or real. So that one will be really fun as well. So we had another question from online. Do different hues or shades of colors show up better or worse than others? That's a tough one to answer. I will say that there are some colors of glass that really don't agree with one another. The different metal oxides that create those colors have a reaction, and they can kind of turn the glass a funky brown color where you don't want it to. Most of those colors are oranges or yellows, especially next to, say, a blue color. Those ones tend to get a really nasty line where those two colors meet. But there's a lot you can do with glass color, especially with the frit that we're using here today. You can create layers and layers of different transparent colors to create a lot of depth to what you're making. So it's kind of like painting in a way, where you can just layer and layer and really create something that has more depth visually than it does necessarily in person. Just to check in what's going on again, here we have the mouth going on, it looks like. So there's that glass rod I was talking about. You can see Helen's got a glove on as she's drawing onto that glass, and that's to protect her hand from the radiant heat coming off of this object. Now, this piece is fairly small. It's not giving off too much heat. But if you have your hand directly above it, especially if you're trying to draw something precise, that's a moment where you definitely want to have a glove on so you're not shaking or having to pull your hand away because your knuckles are getting too hot. So it looks like they're adding some very little details onto that mouth using a very thin strand of black glass. Oh, back around the eyes. So it looks like this is the arms of the sunglasses on our android, our sprinkle bot. And it's really amazing just how detailed you can get with glass. You could spend hours creating every little detail, ears, moles on the face of a robot. You can spend a lot of time. And you can see we've spent a lot of time on the head of this robot because it's one of the more detailed portions. I would say the head and the skirt are super detailed. The skirt itself is a pink color with all these different sprinkles all over the surface of it. But right now they're adding those parts for the eyeglasses. All right, some additional final touches on those sunglasses. Really making sure that they're very well adhered to the side of Sprinklebot's head. That way they won't fall off. Now, a tricky thing with glass is that if you don't have something fully melted together, even when it's cooled down to room temperature, there's the potential for that piece to release itself from the main body of glass. It tends to come more into play when you're working with flame working, which is a type of working with glass where you're using a hot torch similar to the one that Helen's been using to draw all these details on with. But that torch is bench mounted, and you're melting rods of glass to a molten state in the torch and then doing sculpting with it. And that style of working with glass can be very detail oriented. And you can see how it can be used in the hot glass studio as well to create those small little details on your project. Now, when you're flame working, it's often kind of a solo activity. You're just working on your own, kind of making your thing. But when you're working with hot glass, it's very much a team sport. We've all seen how Helen and Chris work together pretty smoothly. They're a very well-oiled machine up here. But when you're working with hot glass, you really want a friend around, not only because it just makes your life a lot easier to have that extra set of hands on board, but also it's just a lot more fun to have someone else around. But you can see how on a small object like this, it's been very useful to have Chris holding the pipe for Helen so she can make all those little details. You can imagine if we were making this on a much larger scale, you'd probably want 2 or 3 more people around helping you. You'd have one person dedicated just to carrying the pipe around, another person dedicated to opening and closing the furnace doors to allow you in and out of the reheating furnace. And then maybe someone else that's just dedicated to shielding your tender forearms from the radiant heat of the glass. We have If a glassmaker wanted to add curves or wavy edges to their work, how would they do that? Well, that's a tricky question because it really depends on what type of work you're looking at. If you're looking to create a wavy rim to an edge of a vessel like this, it's actually easier than it looks. You just spin it out to create a big flat plate, hold it down while it's still very hot, and the glass is going to drape like a cloth, essentially. Now, if you wanted to make a sculpture that had wavy edges, I would use either a butter knife or a tag to really push that glass around and create those soft curves that you're looking for. So that's a question that's tricky to answer just because you need a little more information before you can point them in the right direction. Now it looks like we're beginning on another part here. Helen's collected more clear glass on the end of a hollow stainless steel pipe. She's rolling it through some pink glass now. She's gonna go melt that all smooth together. Now inside of that furnace, I don't think I've explained the gathering process yet. So inside of that furnace, it is 2100 degrees, and there's a large ceramic crucible, essentially a big cereal bowl in there, that holds about 1,000 pounds of molten glass when it's full. To get the glass out of there and onto these pipes, the first thing you have to do is preheat your pipes. We function a lot on the premise that two hot materials will stick together, whether that's permanently or temporarily. So you preheat your pipe, and then you take it and you dive it, submerging the tip of that pipe below the surface of the molten glass. Rotate smoothly in one direction to wind that material on, and then you can pull it out of the furnace and begin creating whatever it is you're aiming to make. Now, so far, I believe we've mostly only seen them going into that furnace just one time to get glass, because all the parts they're making are relatively small. They don't need a big amount of glass to be able to make what they're doing right now. But if you wanted to make something really large, you would allow your previous layer of glass to cool down to around 1,000 degrees. That's where we consider our glass to be cold, meaning it's not going to bend or change, and it's just going to be pretty solid. Then you can go back into that furnace, stick that glass below the surface of the molten glass, and add on another layer. So when you're making something larger, you can do that 2, 3, or even 4 or more times to get just as much glass as you need for the piece you have in mind. Okay. So we have a question. Does glass break on impact at the standard temperature for baking? So I will say, the glass that we're working with here today, soda lime glass, you do not want to stick that in your oven at 400 degrees. It might not explode, but it'll almost certainly crack. And I say that having poured hot water into one of my cups at home and having experienced that personally. So this glass is very prone to what we call thermal shock. And that means sudden changes in temperature. And that goes for both directions. It's not just too hot, but if you make it too cold too suddenly, it'll also crack and break. That's something that we as glass makers run into more than you all would at home. Not too many of us have frozen a cup and had it break as a consequence. But when you're working with glass, if that material gets too cold, whether that's out at the workbench, it could crack and break there, or it can actually crack and break going back into the reheating furnace just from that sudden change in temperature. We've been getting a lot of fun questions online. Do we have any questions here in our audience? Yeah.
I think that's generally easier, but
Yeah, does every piece start with clear glass, or can you start with colored glass? And it really just depends on the facilities that you're working in, what their operation looks like, but also on what you're making. So if you're starting off with colored glass and you're working in a really small facility, it might look something like this, where you preheat a little bit of colored glass, stick this on the end of your pipe, so you're technically starting with colored glass, and then you build all of your clear material over the top of it. This will coat the interior of your vessel with whatever color you had on the end of your blowpipe. But there are some places that have what we call color pots. So it's a furnace dedicated to just melting colored glass. In those situations, you might make something just out of colored glass. But the tricky thing with that is, for one, if you're working in a community-based studio, everybody's got to agree on one color. And then for two, if you have that furnace full of colored glass and you don't have a furnace full of clear glass, If you wanted to make something out of a different color, it would be really tricky to change, say, a blue glass into like a brown glass, for example. So we like to start with clear glass, and that's pretty standard for most studios because it's kind of just a blank canvas. You can do anything with it. You can add all sorts of colors to it. You could leave it clear and just work with that. So it is pretty standard to add your color as you go, starting with that clear base. Now that being said, there are some factories that have a furnace that melts just white glass and a furnace that melts just blue glass and a furnace that melts clear glass. And that you'll typically see in like big industrial lighting facilities, like in Venice, where they're just making these products all day long. And they really need to be able to quickly add on a layer of that white glass or blue glass or whatever it is.
Do you think I should try to ruffle, like, what did he
I was thinking the same thing before. It's like silver
All right, so another question from online. What dictates what tools are wet and what tools are dry? So to catch everyone up to speed on that, I don't think I've talked about our blocks. So we have a host of different tools up here. Some of them are metal tools. Some of them are wooden tools. The wooden tools that you use on the glass that's fresh out of the furnace tend to be saturated with water. And you do that because you don't want that wood to stick to the surface of your glass. So by having them saturated with water, when they make contact with that molten material, the water turns to steam and creates a protective buffer between both materials. Now, on occasion, you might see someone dunking a metal tool in the water. And that can be to cool the tool down, especially those tweezers. If you use the tweezers on the glass and they get too hot, they'll actually stick to the glass and can force you to pull something a little further than you meant to. So it really just depends on what the purpose of that tool is for whether or not you introduce it to water. Working with glass, does the glass ever explode unexpectedly? You know, not too often. The biggest explosion type of thing that you'd have is, say we're doing a punty transfer, and the punty's too cold, and the piece drops to the ground and kind of just explodes as it hits the ground. That's kind of the main situation I can think of that. But also, if you just had a big amount of glass, and you allowed it to get really, really cold, it would eventually crack and explode off the end of your pipe. Now, we actually, when we put our pipes that have a little bit of glass on them, we put them into this very large basin over here. And you'll notice just how tall this is, and that's to keep the glass that's exploding off the ends of the pipes from exploding all over the studio. Now, the reason the glass explodes off the ends of the pipes is glass shrinks quite a bit as it cools down. Not so much that we would notice it, like this isn't going to come out of the kiln at the end of the day like a shrink-a-dink, but it does shrink enough that it's not compatible with the steel. The steel doesn't shrink very much at all as it's cooling down. So the ends of the pipes are actually self-cleaning in a way. The glass shrinks and then explodes off as it gets too shrunk for the steel. So right now we're working on the skirt for our sprinkle bot. Helen's adding some of those pleated folds into the skirt to give it a little more texture, a little more pizzazz to fit Sprinklebot's personality. And it looks like they've encased the glass that had the pink on it with a little layer of clear. And that can be really helpful when you're torching the surface of the glass because different colors can react differently with the chemistry of your oxygen propane fueled torch. Some colors really don't like too much oxygen, and some of them can't get enough of it. Yeah, so we just had a question from online about if glass shrinks as it cools. If you want something designed to be a specific size, do you have to compensate for that shrinking? And the answer is not really. It doesn't shrink perceivably to us, but it does shrink enough that it's not compatible with a lot of materials for that reason. A lot of metals specifically just don't go well with glass. If you tried to embed a piece of iron in your glass, it's almost certainly going to crack as it cools down, just from that glass trying to shrink and the metal really not wanting to. Now that being said, there is one type of metal that is compatible with our glass. It expands and contracts at the same rate as our material, and that's copper. So you can actually use copper wire winding it around your glass to create different designs in the material. But yeah, in terms of making precise objects, the real tricky part about that is just making it in a specific size. So you'll notice that Helen has a lot of calipers out on her tool bench, and that's so that she can make all of these things to the appropriate scale, so that when she goes to put all these parts together, the skirt's not going to be enormous compared to the legs or the head. So she's taken all of these measurements so that she can make a pretty precise piece to be able to put all of these objects together. And that's a really tricky thing to do. There's a lot of different glass artists that will have a production line that they make where all of their tumblers are pretty much the same exact size, and that's from experience and just measuring while you're working. Just like any other material. It's kind of like you measure twice, cut once. And it looks like we've got some really neat pleats going on with this skirt so far.
I think it's probably best to wait for the sprinkles till we get it connected too, don't you think?
Sure.
Otherwise it's gonna be dropping off.
Yeah.
Let's drop this out a little bit so we can
So we've had a question following up to what I was just talking about, working with metal and glass and how copper is compatible with the glass we have in the furnace here. Someone is asking about working with borosilicate glass, which is a totally different type of glass than what we're working with. It has all the ingredients for our glass in different ratios, but it also has a little boron in it. And that glass actually shrinks less than the glass that we're working with here today. Now, I don't know of metals that are precisely compatible with borosilicate glass, but I've seen some people make things that have little inclusions of like a threaded steel to be able to make knobs for cabinets, and I've seen that work before, but I wouldn't swear by it. So the answer is perhaps I would encourage experimentation.
Want a little dome plenty on a small counterweight?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we had another question from online about, do different types of glass break from different thermal ranges? And the answer is absolutely. Our glass, the critical point for this glass, is around 700 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's the temperature at which, if it gets below that or above that too quickly, it's going to crack and break.
Can I have you for 1 second, please?
Yeah.
I forgot to put the hole in the bottom.
Now, with borosilicate glass, it's got a lot more leeway for that. I actually work both in the hot glass studio and in the torch working studio. And for the first several months of working in a torch working studio, my teacher didn't turn on the kiln at all. And he told us if you can allow a marble to get down to room temperature without it cracking and breaking, then you know how to add color onto your clear borosilicate glass correctly. Now, the reason for that is one of the biggest causes of failure with borosilicate glass is bubbles in the material. Borosilicate glass melts at a much higher melting temperature. And if you have little bubbles in your glass, especially if they're bubbles with a sharp profile, as that marble or pendant, whatever you've made, cools down quickly, those bubbles will turn into cracks and run creating a broken object. So I was kind of forced to learn how to add color onto my borosilicate glass in a really good manner because I didn't have the forgiveness of the kiln in the beginning. Now that being said, all types of glass should be annealed, and those objects did eventually get annealed. If glass isn't annealed, there's stress that's captured in the matrix of the material, and it might not break immediately, but it's almost certainly going to break eventually. So all things should be annealed, but I think it's pretty interesting to know that borosilicate glass has a little more give in terms of what the rules are compared to what we're working with down here. Why did we just drill into the glass? So this is going to be the skirt. It's a hollow form. We're going to be sealing the top of this with the top of the robot. So in order to prevent creating a vacuum in those two sealed bubbles, we had to drill a little hole in it so that it wouldn't just expand every time we went to heat it up and then suck in on itself every time we came out of the heat. That can be a pretty funny thing to see. I think I've seen it mostly in ornaments. You accidentally squeeze down your neckline a little too much, go back into the reheating furnace, and it'll get really big. And you come out of the reheating furnace, and it'll suck right in on itself. So that's a weird thing about glass. You have to know a little bit about physics, at least to the point where you can avoid situations like that. So anytime we're creating a sculpted form or any form that's going to be more or less sealed off, we still have to leave a little opening to prevent that vacuum from happening. Now, interestingly enough, we use a tungsten bit when we're drilling into the glass. And the reason for that is the tungsten will just kind of puncture through the glass when it's relatively cold. You heat up the tungsten, drill it into the glass, and it's just like drilling into butter almost. It's the weirdest sensation. But here, Helen's opening up the top of that skirt. She's going to get it to just the right size to be able to fit the torso of the android right down into the skirt and create a nice connection between the two. Chris is using a wooden board to help her make sure that the top of that skirt is nice and straight. You don't want any wiggles or wobbles in that since you're going to be sealing it up with another piece of glass. And now she's taking a measurement. So like I was saying about making really precise things, you want to measure everything. So she measures it so that she can make sure that when she creates the torso, she'll have a matching opening that she can touch down to make an exact connection.
Is our artist with us today?
So we have a question from online. Where do the glass makers decide where to start on the design? And I'll say it's really from just experience working with the material, sculpting different things. You try something new and then you figure out like, oh, if I'm going to create something that looks like a person, I've got a system now. I'll make the legs first, put them away, make the bottom, put that away, make the top, put that away. But this is not Helen's first time sculpting glass. So I'll point that out. I did see her at the beginning of today kind of drawing the different shapes that she would need it and then deciding what order to make those shapes in. So she made the legs first, the arms second, the skirt, or the head, then the skirt. And I think now we're probably going to be working on the torso. Is that accurate, Helen? All right.
I think you've got all the other parts, right?
Yeah, I think so. So it's really just, it's kind of like doing a puzzle. You have all the parts that you need, and you just have to kind of think in glass terms how to best make them. That's one of my favorite things about glass. Whenever you're working with something new, you really have to problem solve a lot, both ahead of time and in the moment while you're working with it. We get asked a lot what the most difficult thing is to make out of glass. And the answer to that is always the thing you haven't made before. That's always the most difficult thing.
If they wanted to add like depth into the glass, how would they do that? Would it just be all of it added later, or
Yeah. So we've had a question from online. How would you add depth to the glass? Would it be from adding more layers of glass, more bubbles, more colors? And I would say it really depends on what your goal is with that object. If you want to have a fairly solid piece of glass that you can look into and see different depths and worlds, you can really use every gather of glass as an opportunity to add more color, more design, more depth to that object. So every layer of clear you have is going to set whatever color you put onto the surface of that clear a little more in the foreground of what's in the background. So by creating layers and layers of clear and color and clear and color and clear and color, you can really achieve a nice depth to the material. Now that being said, with sculptures, you can also just add more and more parts on and create depth that way. So it really just depends on what the goal is with that. How would you create depth with texture? Well, I'll say experimenting with different materials and what they do to the glass can be really handy. You can use cane, similar to what Helen used to draw on the face of the sprinkle bot to create textures. You can create textures or the illusion of textures by picking up a lot of those canes, adding them to the surface, doing the same thing again, and just building up layer and layer of very fine details onto the material. You can also use different tools to create textures. Some of our tools have texture built into them. Some of our crimps have little waves on the interiors of them that will translate into the glass. We have an assortment of molds down here that will add texture to the glass. You can also, bring in different materials and roll the glass on it and see what sort of texture you get off of that. So like corrugated metals, say, roll that on the glass. You can create your own tools by assembling different metal parts together with just the goal of making texture on glass. And one of the neatest things about glass is that you can really replicate just about any texture that you see on other materials to make the glass look and feel like it's not glass. So it really is just about experimentation, trying out different things, seeing what happens to it. So now again, it looks like we're working on a hollow form. This is the torso for our sprinkle bot. And I'd like to point out our new blowing system that we have here. The way that Helen's inflating the glass is through the use of a tube like this. This gets attached onto what is traditionally the mouthpiece for the blowpipe. And then this tube is hooked up to an air compressor system, which is controlled by a foot pedal. So as Helen taps on the foot pedal, she's actually inflating the glass. And this was Corning's response to us keeping our masks on, but still sharing our love of glass with all of you. We wanted to take our mouths out of the glass blowing equation. And so this is how we've done it, through this automated blowing system. So Helen's been inflating that glass. We can't really see the bubble because it's obscured by our layers of color, but just watching for that little motion in the glass, the little bit of expansion, that's what tells you that that piece is hollow. And that's the cue that you look for as a glassmaker to know if your bubble's actually out in the material or not. That can be really tricky for beginning glassmakers, especially when you first start dabbling in color. You'll go, I swear there's a bubble in there. And then 5 minutes later, you realize that there sure wasn't, and it makes your life a little difficult. Now, the pad that Helen was just using to shape that glass, that's actually made out of newspaper. And that's one of those tools that we keep saturated with water so that the newspaper isn't bursting into flames in Helen's hand, but also so that it's not sticking to the surface of the glass itself. But the really nice thing about those newspaper pads is they conform to the palm of your hand in such a way that you can shape the glass as if you were touching it with your bare hand. So they're a pretty handy tool. And they also make you look really cool because they're all smoky, add a little atmosphere to the glass blowing. But that's a tool that every now and then we'll refresh it just by spritzing it with water to keep it from getting too hot, bursting into flames.
Necessary to have someone like
Okay, so we had a question online about if it's important to have one dedicated assistant that you're always working with, or if it's okay to kind of mix it up every now and then, work with different people. And I'll say it really depends on what your goal is. If you want to be making really precise things, and especially if you're beginning, you might find it's most comfortable to really get in the groove and work with someone that you're comfortable with. But any good glassmaker can work with just about any other good glassmaker. We all speak kind of the same language of glass, meaning if Helen told me she needs a punty, I'd know exactly what to get her without having to think about it too much. But yeah, it's really just personal preference. I know some glassmakers that really just like working with the people that they work with the most. And I know some that travel around visiting all sorts of different studios, working with whoever's available in those towns. So yeah, it's all just preference. All right, so Helen's moved further
All right,
ahead in
so
that torso. She
I wanna do
created
the
a
pink-
constriction that separates
pink,
the body of
wrap,
the torso
please.
from
No,
the pipe
the
itself.
collar part.
That constriction is a structural weak point that'll allow her to break the body free from the blowpipe a little later on. But just about everything we make in this studio gets one of those constrictions. The tool she made it with is a large metal tool called the jacks. The constriction itself is often called a neckline or a jackline in reference to that tool. But you have to have that constriction in there so that you can thermally shock the glass, really stealing the heat right out of that constriction and have it break right where you need it to. If you forget the constriction, you're pretty much relying on dumping water on the glass and hoping that it'll break where you need it to. Yeah. Other than the Corelware and the Pyrex, is everything else in our gift shop handmade? And I believe a lot of it is. I haven't looked at everything in that collection, but we do try to support especially local artists around us. But yeah, a lot of it is handmade items. All the pumpkins are absolutely handmade. Yep. And those are a great object that gets sold pretty exclusively by different artists from the region. So if you go into the gift shop and you find a pumpkin that you like, make sure you take a look at what artist made it. So if something happens or you want to get another one to match it, you know who to contact. All right, so it looks like we're getting ready to add some additional details onto this. Chris has a wrap of glass, or a trail of glass it looks like. And he pointed that glass up using that Marver table, kind of like sharpening a pencil. If you want to make really precise lines out of this material, you want it to have a nice pointy shape. He's now heating that up, getting it really hot so that Helen can apply that, dragging that line and shaping it just the way she needs it to go on. I believe this will be the collar and the line going down the middle of our bowling shirt here. So there she goes, up and around, and then right back up. Beautiful. Now, I love it when we're doing something like that. It really shows you just how stretchy this material is. glass is a material that'll stretch into long strands for as long as it's hot. So if I were to take a bit of glass out of the furnace, grab a hold of the end, maybe set the pipe over there, I could literally run all the way around the studio a few times before that glass would be too cold to continue stretching. When you do that, the glass will cool down very rapidly if it's like the size of a human hair. It'll cool down almost instantly, and then you can touch it right away, which is interesting. Now we have the one stripe on our bowling shirt here. She's straightening that out, making sure it's all where it needs to go, using that butter knife again. And it looks like Chris is getting ready to pick something up out of our garage over here. So he's created a punty of glass, and he's going to use that to pick up one of the pre-made parts inside of the garage. Oh, no, it's more details for our bowling shirt here. So they have 2 pieces of cane inside of our garage warmed up so that they can stick it on and create those orange stripes that kind of go down either side, you know, that standard bowling shirt design. And the cane is going to work really well for this. It's an amber cane, so it has an amber color with a white underneath it, so it'll kind of have a highlighter color going through the middle of it, and then a softer tone of that amber on the edges. While he's getting that ready, Helen's further refining the form that she has here. You'll notice whenever she's sculpting something and working on one side of it, every now and then she has to flip that object over, nudge it back down to center, and then go back to shaping on the side that she wants to be shaping. And the reason for that is the glass is still moving at this stage, even if it doesn't seem to be moving very quickly. So she still has to compensate for gravity's effect on the material and make adjustments to make sure that it's all in an agreeable shape. So Chris has one of those canes picked up on the end of a rod here. He's going to get it hot, bring it over to Helen. She's preheating the area where that cane's going to be stuck on, using that oxygen propane fueled torch again. Now, because the piece that Chris has such a small mass, he had to go back in and heat it up again because they didn't want it to thermally shock as they apply it to the body of Sprinklebot. So now Helen's going to break the excess of that off, just holding a cold tool and asking Chris for a little tap.
About the key nips?
It did break, but not quite where they wanted it to.
I got the shears, Chris, if you just bring it.
Want the next one?
All right, so she's going to nip off that excess material there. And this tool is just designed for cutting rods of glass. They're called disc nippers. And they're essentially 2 little wheels that are sharpened that you can crunch onto the glass until it'll crack and break. Very useful for cutting rods like that. Now we have one stripe on, we'll need another one, so they're going to be heating up another piece of cane here. Now they made these canes purposely a little too long. That gave them a little more leeway. Just like making anything else, it's better to have a little extra than a little or too little of something. So Helen's already preheating that area for the cane to be stuck onto. as they're doing all of these complicated patterns and adding parts on, they're constantly checking in with one another. I don't know if you all can hear that, but they'll say, "Are you ready this time, or do you need a flash?" And that's because, along with the teamwork, just communicating with your team is one of the more important parts of glassmaking. If something's not ready at exactly the right time, if Helen were to spend too long sitting there waiting for Chris to bring those parts over, there's the potential
that'd be
for the
good.
base to crack and break. So by talking to one another, they're really letting each other know, like, "Oh, you need to take a little heat. I'm not quite hot enough yet." Yeah. And then sometimes it's nice to have an extra person around so you can say, "I gotta go get this other part. Can you help Helen poke a hole in this?" And that's what I'm here for. Now, getting a closer view of this, I can tell you it's looking really exciting. I can't wait to see this all come together. So checking the measurement, making sure that this torso is going to fit into the skirt nicely. We'll also be poking a hole in this piece. And that's because it's going to get attached to the skirt, and then the head's going to get attached on top of this. So if we were to just attach it to the skirt, we would be creating a sealed off portion, a vacuum, in our torso by sealing it with the head. So it has to breathe into the skirt, which breathes out to the normal air, in order to avoid that vacuum situation I talked so much about earlier. Some further adjustments on the collar going on here, really making sure that Sprinklebot looks nice and snazzy. And it looks like Chris has begun picking up other parts here. Yep, he's got the skirt out, beginning to warm that up so that we can start sticking all of this together. And I'll tell you, this is the part where sculpting is going to get really exciting. We've been watching them make all these parts, which can take some time to get all those details on the parts. But now we're going to start to see the whole vision come together. All right.
Ooh, that's it.
So now we have a hole in the bottom of our torso. This will allow us to attach the skirt without creating a vacuum between the two. Meanwhile, Chris is over here heating up the rim of the skirt, the waistband, so that we can stick these two together. Now, often when you're sticking two open bubbles together in glass, that's a technique called encalmo. And it can be used to create colorful patterns and kind of lines. So if you've ever seen a vessel that has many stripes of horizontal stripes of color on it, that's typically through an encalmo process. Today we're doing it a little irregularly. We haven't opened up the bubble on our torso. Instead, just drilled a hole into it. But if this bubble had been open, we would be creating one continuous bubble of the two different parts. So now Chris has that rim of the skirt super hot. Helen's going to take it, guide it to where she needs it to go, and they're going to stick the two materials together here. So they get that stuck on. They're going to really torque it around to make sure it's sticking all along the waistband of that skirt. Now a little thermal shock to get rid of that punty on the skirt, and a light tap is all it takes. Yeah, feel free to applaud at any stage. That's always a pretty exciting thing when it goes smoothly, having those two parts come together in a nice, easy fashion. There's a lot of things that can go wrong at moments like that. If something's a little too cold or too hot, it'll either stay on forever or come off too easily. Now we have our torso, the skirt. It looks like Chris is preparing another part to be brought in the garage.
I'm gonna put those sprinkles on there first before things get crazy.
So we're gonna start putting sprinkles on this skirt here. So Helen has a variety of different canes pulled out that she'll use for those sprinkles. So she's heating that rod up and just drawing some fun little lines on it. And I feel like this is one of the most important details to Sprinklebot. If Sprinklebot didn't have any sprinkles on her, she wouldn't be much of a Sprinklebot. So we've got some red sprinkles on there now. We'll add a couple of additional colors as well. But every now and then we have to take Sprinklebot back to the reheating furnace so that her torso doesn't get too cold and crack and break. That's what Chris was doing with that other torch as well here just a moment ago. Just giving some additional heat to the top portion of the form so that it doesn't have any risk of cracking and breaking at all. So right now we're adding some yellow sprinkles. Sorry, I misspoke. It looks like our previous sprinkle was more of an orange color. And this one is a very vibrant yellow. Now for some green sprinkles. And the sprinkles we're adding right now are a lovely light blue, it looks like. Do we have any more colors we're adding onto this, Helen?
But you're talking to that material.
All right, so now we have all of our sprinkles on there. Chris has begun prepping the legs to attach onto the bottom of our skirt here. And the skirt's really going to be an illusion, right? The bottom is a bubble. It's flat, more or less. They're going to be sticking the legs right onto that flat plane to give the illusion that that skirt is hollow. I mean, it is hollow. It's just not open on the bottom. So right now, Helen is making sure all of those sprinkles are very firmly attached to the body of the skirt, just by giving them all a little additional heat here. And then Chris is also superheating the top of the leg where it will attach to the skirt so that they can stick it on there. Really, when you're sculpting with glass, heat is your glue. If you have it hot enough and stick it on there, it's going to form into one piece of glass. If it's not hot enough, it's like not having enough glue when you're trying to put together a cardboard project, say. It'll just fall right apart. So Chris preheated his glass. Helen's also preheating where she wants that leg to go. Chris brings it over, and this is a really tricky moment. You want to make sure you put that leg on in the right orientation relative to the body. It's deceptively easy to put a leg on backwards on something. She gets it on, they tap free the iron that leg was attached to. Now we've got one leg down and one to go. Now, as Chris is picking up these objects in our garage unit, he has to make sure that they're warm enough to come out of the garage and go into the reheating furnace. Even pulling something out of that garage and just taking it directly to the reheating furnace can be enough of a thermal change to shock the glass. So there's a burner inside of that garage, and he's holding the glass up above where that burner's at. Of course, the hottest air is going to be directly above the flame. So by introducing the glass to that, it's kind of a gentle way of heating it up a little bit further before you go and put it into the reheating furnace. Now, as he does this, he's also making sure that everything looks exactly the way it was when Helen put that leg into that garage. If something moved or cracked or shifted in the process of being in the garage, he has an opportunity here to fix it, adjust it if it needs it, before they take it over and stick it onto the sculpture. And that's why when you're working with glass, you want to be working with someone that you really trust to help you with what you're doing. Communicating with them all of the parts of the process you're going to be doing really helps to that end. But glassmaking is really an exercise in trust in a lot of ways. You have to trust your assistant to help you just the way you need. And as an assistant, you have to trust the person you're working with to communicate everything they need from you.
Yep.
So here we go. They're going to be attaching it this heat. Now, in order to have something with two legs that stands upright, that can be a pretty tricky thing to do. So in order to have our sprinkle bot here be able to stand free and on her own, they're going to be adding a little bit of glass right below their feet. This will help them just stand upright.
Yeah, just covered it.
So it looks like we covered up our hole in the skirt with one of the legs. So in order to avoid that vacuum, they're going to be popping another hole into it here. And you'll notice they did that pretty quickly after realizing they'd sealed off that opening. They don't want to get SprinkleBot too hot with that skirt sealed off. The skirt's a little on the thick side, so it's not going to implode right away. But you want to get that hole in there right away to avoid that possibility at any other part of the process. So Helen's going to make final adjustments to those legs, get them exactly in the orientation they need to be in. So right now she's really crisping up the angles on the feet of SprinkleBot, making sure that they're nice and pointy like the drawing has. But she wants to make any adjustments that she needs to those feet right now, because in a moment here they're going to be adding on what we call a cookie foot. So a cookie foot is when you deposit a little bit of glass right onto this marver table here, and then you can actually stick whatever it is you're making onto that cookie of glass, and it'll create a solid foot for the base of whatever you're making. Now, for this, it'll create a pedestal for this little SprinkleBot to be able to stand upright without having to be perfectly balanced, so she can stand on just 2 feet. But it can also be used as an element for blown objects as well. Looking around on the front of our stage for an example of a cookie foot. Now, I'm not seeing one. Oh, there's one right down here. Now, solid feet can be added in multiple different ways, but this object right here has one of those cookie feet on it. So it's going to be a little clear disc that SprinkleBot will be standing up on.
Let me narrow this neck down a little bit. Well, actually, no. I think we'll be all right. Narrow it down on the other side.
So now Chris is going to collect the glass for that. And again, they're timing all of this just perfectly. They don't want SprinkleBot's feet to be too hot when they go to stick her onto her little stand, but they also don't want them to be too cold. If they're too hot, they could lose some of the definition of the details in her feet. If she's too cold, she could potentially not stick properly to that cookie foot. So it's always a fine balancing of different temperatures. You can really think of glass makers as heat managers in a way, because that's really one of the primary things that we're concerned with while we're working with this. But here we go. Chris has a little glass, and this will give you a really good idea of what would happen if we were to just stop rotating the pipe. He's going to literally drip that glass right onto the surface of the table. It'll pool out because it's so hot, it's just going to keep flowing. He cuts it free, and that glass just sinks down on itself. Now, to get rid of that cold spot from the cut mark, he'll just heat it up a little bit. And then Helen will stick SprinkleBot right onto that cookie foot. And you can see just how well it adheres at that temperature. The glass that Chris put onto the marver was so hot that it was literally cooling. And the glass that Helen had was relatively cold in that moment because she didn't want the feet to warp or change as she stuck that glass on. But most importantly, if you had those feet way too hot, went to stick that foot on, the weight of the foot could really change the feet themselves. It could even pull them off of the figure if it were way, way, way too hot. So now making adjustments to that connection. Would you like a paddle? So we can work together here. She can shape the sides and the top of that, while I just make sure that that foot stays nice and flat.
That would be preferable, thank you.
Now, to finish adding all of the rest of the details onto Sprinklebot, we're going to actually break her free from the pipe she's currently attached to and have her on a secondary rod called a punty.
I think so. I think there's enough thickness in there to be able to break it free.
Now, Chris will be preparing the punty. By doing this, we're going to gain better access to the shoulders and neck portion of Sprinklebot. This is also what we would do to be able to open up a bubble of glass that we're making a vessel out of. So all of these objects on the front of our stage went through this transfer process because originally they were all stuck to the blowpipe where the rim of the vessel is. So Chris is preparing the punty. Helen's making sure everything's just right before they go for this transfer. And they're balancing the temperatures of everything out as well. Chris is cooling his glass down. Helen's equalizing all of the temperatures on the different parts that she has on her glass in preparation for this transfer. All right, here we go. Helen takes that punty, sticks it right onto the center of the bottom of that foot. They turn back and forth together here to make sure everything is right in line with the blowpipe. A little cold air on that punty connection will freeze it in place, prevent it from wiggling around when they go to break it free from the blowpipe. A little thermal shock to that neckline, and a tap is all it takes to set it free. Please feel free to applause. Now, I think I've said this already through some of our other punties that we've gone through, but for those of you that just joined us, that's one of the trickiest things to do when you first start blowing glass. It's really easy to mess it up because all of the temperatures are really specific for what you need. If your punty's too cold, you go to break it free, it'll fall on the ground. If your punty's too hot, it'll be stuck on there forever. So there's a lot of really finessing that goes into learning how to do that transfer. Right now, Helen's superheating the top portion of Sprinklebot's torso. And you can see there's a very small opening there. Now, if we were making a vessel out of glass, that opening would be what gets stretched wider and wider to be the rim of the vessel. But for this, that's going to be where the neck for the head is going to be attached. So she wants to make sure to get that in just the right shape to be able to make that connection. So she's superheating that spot.
You want her to bring that over on the shovel and you hold the money?
I'll have her hold it. Yeah.
So it looks like she's going to be cleaning up where that neck is going to be attached. Right where it was connected to the blowpipe, there's kind of a naked spot in terms of color.
Get a good long flap.
So by trimming away that spot that was void of color, we'll have a nice seamless connection to the head when we stick that on.
Let's get out.
So now Helen's got a hold of that head. She's using
Not grabbing square things or,
a really neat tool that's designed for grabbing parts of glass. It's a three-pronged tool. And it's proving to be a little tricky to grab a hold of square parts of glass. Like I said in the beginning of this, glass doesn't want to be square usually. So a lot of our tools are designed with that
For the hair.
Is that just a little bit big?
in
I
mind.
think so.
Just a little block?
Actually, you know what? Just mix it with the cranberry on top that kind of matches this. Yeah.
So now we have our head on there, but she still needs her funky hairstyle. And that seems to be what's coming next.
A hot blob?
Yeah.
Right now, Helen's really refining the connection of the neck to the shoulders here.
No. A little bit more. Double that. And I think I will have you flatten it slightly so that we can kind of drape it across as like a flat oval.
So Chris is preparing the hair. He's got a nice amount of clear glass here, and he's going to add on some pink color too. So to give the hair a little depth, I think we're going to be going into 2 shades of pink is what I just
2 rolls of
overheard.
transparent on top, just one.
This one.
We have a base of opaque pink and then a transparent pink that we'll put over the top to give it that beautiful translucency that is in the description for Sprinkle Bot.
You want like a flat graph thing?
Just a very slight tap to it so that I can lay it on the forehead first and then wrap it around the back. This one I do, yeah. Okay, I'm good for now. Thank you.
Want more symmetrical or maybe like the graph?
Kind of like an egg. Just leave it as sort of an egg and just give it a tap.
So right now
on
they're
mostly
kind
the
of
tip.
talking about the
then
best
I just
shape
don't want
to
it to
have
glue-
that
glog
hair
over
bit
her
in
eyes.
order to add it
Just sort of
down
like-
and have it kind of draping
Flatten
over the
the very
head with a
tip a
little
little bit.
hairstyle to it.
So it's like a flat egg.
Whenever you're adding bits of glass, we call it bit work because it's just a little bit of glass that you're adding on. You always want to have it in a specific shape before you add it to whatever you're adding it to. Now, different bits can be different shapes. You can have them be triangular, have them be flat, have them be round is kind of the most standard.
Straighten it down. I'll probably go and twist
And I
it.
think we have this one kind of in an oval shape or flat-ish.
Ready?
So he brings it over, holds it straight up and down. Helen's going to stick it on. He'll turn that bit so it doesn't fold up on itself and then cut it free. Now we have a beautiful hairstyle on Sprinklebot. And of course, this is the glass hairstyle that Sprinklebot got here at the Corning Museum of Glass in the year 3000. So we'll have to look forward to her coming in the next 1,000 years to get this hairstyle done for real. Here we go, adding some texture to that hair when it's freshly applied.
Sorry, that was a little
really, as soon as you get that glass on there, you want to use as much of the heat from when you add it on to do as much of the sculpting as you can, because it can be really tricky to heat up just the hair on this without getting the neck of Sprinkle Bot hot. Then her whole head's going to be moving around while you're trying to add details. So you really have to be concise with your movements while you're shaping glass. For that reason, it's not really a material you can just sit down with and make something without putting any thought into it. You always want to know where you're going with it before you even collect it out of the furnace. If you don't have a firm plan for the glass, then the material is going to make a lot more decisions for you than you probably want it to. All right, so we've got her beautiful hairstyle on. Now she needs some arms. So that's coming up next. Chris is getting those arms ready to go. Helen's making some final adjustments onto that hair. So here we go, superheating the shoulder of that arm, getting it stuck on. So Helen's getting that arm all organized in the position she needs it in. Right now, I'm just holding this pipe still so it's not wiggling around on her as she's trying to torque on that arm. And when you're working on sculpture, that's really an important part. You want to have someone holding that pipe steady for you so that you can add those parts on without having it moving and wobbling around.
Monster arm. All right, Chris.
All right, so we've got one more arm coming up. She's called Chris over.
Buff for sure. All right, straight up and down, like side.
So we get that
Go for a quick flash. I'll come back and really switch on there.
we get that tacked on, and then we want to take a quick flash, make sure Sprinklebot's body is nice and warm, and then we'll be able to sure up the connection, make sure it's all exactly the way it needs to be here.
Yeah, Chris, get that back in.
Now, when we added those arms on, we had to hold SprinkleBot still. So we're making some adjustments to make sure
I'm gonna stretch it up.
that she's standing nice and tall. So we'll give her a little extra heat here, and this will allow Helen to straighten out anything that moved around as we were adding those arms on. All right, so we have all the parts on. Helen's warming up the hands a little bit here. Oh, she's going to give the hands a little further detail, crimping some little grabbers in there.
Making the clamps and we're done.
The clamps, and then we're done. So we've got to give SprinkleBot a way to pick things up and do her android job, I'm sure she has. So just with a little nip of a pair of shears, a little finagling with some fancy tweezers, and we'll create our little grabber claws. So as we are approaching the end of this, I'd like to again remind you all that we do have 2 upcoming You Design It, We Make It programs coming up. The next one, the deadline to submit for the prompt Things That Go Bump in the Night, will be October 28th at 12 p.m. Look for that on our demonstration information page. There's a link to be able to submit your own design. And again, if your design gets chosen, then you can keep that piece. You can actually come pick it up if you're local, or pay a fee to have it shipped to you if you're not local. And I think that's pretty exciting. Being able to collaborate with a glassmaker, regardless of where you're at or having access to glass facilities, is a pretty neat thing about this program. Another one that we have coming up is We've Got Spirit. Yes, we do. And they're looking for new, different designs for mascots, whether it's for a real team or an imagined team. It can be whatever it is that you'd like. And the deadline for that one for submission is November 24th at 12 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And I'd encourage all of you to submit. There's really nothing to lose there. If you don't get chosen, you'll still get to watch a really interesting object get made. But if you do get chosen, it's really exciting to see your vision brought to life, not only by extremely skilled glassmakers, but just to see something you've drawn on paper turned into glass is pretty darn exciting. But here we go, we've got the other grabber claw being formed. A little extra heat on those fine points will make them a little more malleable, easier to smush around. Now, the final step for a glass object like this is going to be a very slow cooling process. When they break it free from that from that punty iron that it's attached to, they'll be rushing it off to the oven over here, where it's going to spend the remainder of the day and the better part of tomorrow very slowly cooling down to room temperature. That process is called annealing, and it's dictated the length of time that it takes by the thickness of the glass itself. So if you have very thin objects, like say you've been making ornaments all day long, you can get away with cooling those down in an 8-hour period because they're so thin. But for sculptural objects, they tend to be a little thicker. So you have to give them a little more time to cool down. And the reason for that is you want all of those different thicknesses of glass to be equalized so that they're all the same temperature at different stages of the cooling process. So this will hold at 900 degrees until we're finished working for the day. That's plenty of time for the arms and the legs and the skirt and the torso to all be the same temperature. Then it'll very slowly come down to 700 degrees, hold there for a little while, again to allow everything to equalize. And it'll do that until it gets down to around 200 degrees. And that's where the glass is kind of safe in terms of being able to open that oven door and finally take a peek at what you've made the day before. That's always exciting. It's like having a holiday all the time. There we have it, Sprinkle By. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, and also I'd like to thank Vanessa, our artist, for submitting this awesome design and trusting us really with her idea to be able to create this beautiful android out of glass. Right now, Helen's really equalizing all the temperatures before they go to put it away. Chris has on a pair of Kevlar gloves. You'll notice he's very well suited up. The oven he's going to be reaching into to put this object away is at 900 degrees Fahrenheit. So he really wants to protect himself. He warmed up those Kevlar mitts though, so that they're not going to shock the glass as he grabs a hold of it. So here we go, a few drops of water to weaken that connection. A sharp tap to the iron. SprinkleBot is now free. Now to get rid of the sharp edge where it was attached to that iron, a little additional heat is used. And then away it goes. All right, and there we have it. Let's give it up for Helen and Chris, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. Do we have any last questions before I let you all go?
Do you want to go to lunch, Mark? Or?
Sorry? Oh, thank you. All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us here today, both in person and online. We're really excited about these events, and we love that you all are excited about them as well.
Yeah.
I see we have one question up here. Can you talk real loud for me? What color is the glass? Oh, how did we add color to the glass? So we take our clear glass out of the furnace and then we roll it through this assortment of colored glass down here on the Marver table. The colored glass that we're using is called frit, and it's been crushed up into a specific size so that we can roll that clear material through it, and it'll heat up and stick to the surface of it and create a thin jacket of color over our clear glass. What makes that colored? Different metal oxides added to the raw ingredients for glass. So some of the easiest ones for me to point out is our cobalt blue. That's made with cobalt. The lighter blues, the teal blues, are typically made with copper oxide. And then our pink colors are actually made with gold chloride. So it's all just different metals added to the materials. All right, well, thank you all again so much for joining us here today for our special live stream demonstration. I'm going to let you all go. If you do have any further questions, come on down. I'd love to talk to you. But if not, have a great rest of your day. Thank you again.